The pop in my shoulder was louder than Nash's voice when he shoved me into the workbench. I heard it before I felt it, a wet crack like green wood splitting, and then my left arm hung wrong, and the floor came up fast, and I was sitting against the cabinet with sawdust on my face, and Nash standing over me saying something about how I'd brought this on myself. My daughter was in the house. She had watched him walk me out to the garage, and she had not followed. The next morning, I drove 40 minutes to their subdivision with the lockbox I made for my wife on our wedding day. Florence had kept her earrings in it for 31 years. Nash met me at the door in a pressed golf shirt, smelling like he'd just come from somewhere expensive. He looked at the box in my good hand, and something behind his eyes went very quiet. "You're doing the right thing, Amos," he said. "Come on in." I stepped inside. I set the box on his kitchen island. He ran his thumb along the dovetail joints, feeling the weight of it. "Florence would be proud," he said, because he thought he knew what was inside. "Open it," I said. He did. Before I tell you what he found, let me back up about 4 years, to the Sunday afternoon Nash Holbrook walked into my daughter's life, and, 3 months later, walked into mine wearing a smile that fit a little too perfectly for a man I'd just met. I spent 38 years as a finished carpenter in Knoxville, Tennessee. Trim work, cabinetry, the kind of woodwork that goes into houses people actually live in. I retired at 63 when my knees decided they were done negotiating. Florence and I had planned it that way. Her Social Security and my pension, the paid-off house on Ridgecrest Lane, the workshop in the garage where I'd spend mornings while she tended the garden. We had it mapped out like a set of measured cuts. Clean lines, no wasted material. Then Florence had a heart attack in September of the year I retired, and was gone inside of 18 months. The workshop was still full of half-finished projects when my daughter brought Nash home for Thanksgiving. He came in with a bottle of good bourbon and a firm handshake and spent the first hour asking me questions about the woodworking. Most people who aren't in the trades go quiet when you start talking about joinery. Nash kept leaning forward. He asked about the difference between mortise and tenon versus pocket screws. He asked what wood I preferred for drawer boxes. I remember thinking he was either genuinely curious or very practiced at seeming that way. By the time we sat down to eat, I hadn't decided which. My daughter Leona was 30 that Thanksgiving, teaching 3rd grade out in Farragut. She'd always had a soft heart for people who needed steadying. That was why she was a teacher. I think it was also why Nash found her useful. They were married the following June. I paid for the reception, because it was what Florence would have wanted. I also gave Nash a firm handshake and a private conversation in the backyard, where I told him, without raising my voice, that Leona was the best thing I'd ever built, and I needed him to understand that. He said he did. He said it looking me straight in the eye. He was good at that. The first time he asked me for money was 14 months into the marriage. "A commercial property in Oak Ridge," he said. "A strip mall with vacancies and an owner who needed to liquidate. He had partners lined up but needed a bridge loan for the earnest money. $20,000. He'd have it back to me in 60 days with 6% interest." I said no. Florence had a life insurance policy, $190,000, and I had no intention of touching it before I knew Leona would need it more than I did. Nash smiled and told me not to worry, that he had other resources. He paid for dinner that night and acted as if the conversation had never happened. 8 months after that, it was $12,000 for a storage unit conversion project down in Chattanooga. Something about square footage and the rental market. He had documentation this time. Printouts, a folder with a plastic cover. I read the first 3 pages and told him the numbers didn't work the way he'd written them. He got quiet for a moment, the way a man does when he's deciding how much to show you. Then he said Leona had mentioned that I was sitting on money that was just losing value to inflation. That was the first time I felt the particular cold that comes from understanding something you'd been choosing not to look at directly. I gave him the $12,000. I'm not proud of that. I told myself it was for Leona, that keeping peace in their marriage was worth it. I told myself it was a one-time thing. I should have known that with men like Nash. The first time is just a measurement. He never paid it back. When I brought it up 6 months later, he said he was restructuring. He used the word restructuring the way some men use silence, as a door that shuts the conversation. The afternoon it all broke open. I was in the garage, refinishing a rocking chair I'd bought at an estate sale. Nash's truck pulled in behind Leona's car around 3 in the afternoon. I heard the truck door before I heard anything else. I always heard that truck door. It had a sound to it, a particular weight, like a period at the end of a sentence you didn't want to reach. He came into the garage without knocking. Leona stood in the doorway behind him, her arms crossed over her chest, not looking at me. Amos, we need to talk about the savings account. I set down the sanding block. Florence's account. Leona's inheritance, technically. Half of it under Tennessee law. I've got a deal closing in 72 hours. Waterfront lot in Maryville, pre-approved buyer. I just need liquidity for the title fees and the gap in the bridge loan. $45,000. I'll have it back in 3 weeks. No. He looked around the garage then. At the tools hung on pegboard, at the half-finished rocking chair, at the workbench where Florence used to sit on a stool and tell me about her day while I worked. He looked at all of it like he was taking inventory of something he intended to sell. You keep acting like this money is some kind of memorial to a woman who's already gone, he said, but sitting on it doesn't bring her back. What it does is keep your daughter from having the life she deserves. I stood up, my knees popped when I did. Leona, I said, are you all right? Don't put her in the middle, Nash said. I asked my daughter a question in my own garage. What happened after that was quick the way quick things are. No warning, no preamble. Just his hand flat against my chest and 3 fast steps backward, and then the edge of the workbench catching me across the left shoulder and my arm wrenching sideways as I grabbed for the bench top and missed. The pop was loud. The pain arrived half a second later, like a wave behind a boat. I went down onto one knee and then the floor. Nash stood over me, breathing through his nose. You think about the 45,000, he said. Think real hard. He walked out. I heard him say something to Leona in the driveway. I heard his truck door and his engine, and then I heard nothing except the rocking chair, creaking slightly in the draft from the open garage door. Leona appeared in the doorway. Her face had gone the color of old putty. Daddy, she crouched beside me. Let me call an ambulance. Help me up first. Your arm. Help me up. She got me to the kitchen chair. I could feel the shoulder sitting wrong, a grinding looseness that made me move very carefully. I'd dislocated it once before in 1998, falling off a scaffold. This had the same quality, that sense of a puzzle piece removed from where it belongs. Leona, I kept my voice level. Has he done this to you? She looked at the kitchen floor. She looked for a long time. Has he? When she finally looked up, I already knew the answer. How long? Daddy, please don't. How long has he been putting his hands on you? It's not. He doesn't always. It's only when the deals go sideways. He gets so stressed and he... Stop. She stopped. Stop making his excuses right now. She nodded. Then she put her face in her hands and cried without making a sound, the way people cry when they've learned to keep it quiet. I reached over with my good arm and put my hand on her wrist. My shoulder ground against itself. I didn't move it again. I need you to go home, I said. She looked up. I need you to act like nothing happened today. Tell him you talked me down. Tell him I'm thinking about it. Can you do that? What are you going to do? I'm going to make a call. Then I'm going to get this shoulder looked at. And then I'm going to need you to trust me the way you did when you were little, and I told you something was going to be okay. She looked at me for a long time. Then she nodded and she left. I sat at my kitchen table and dialed a number I hadn't used in 6 years. My old union rep back from my carpenter's local days had connected me with her once, when a general contractor tried to short my final draw. Naomi Delafield ran one of the better family law and civil practices in Knox County, and she answered on the 3rd ring and listened without interrupting while I told her what had happened. When I finished, she was quiet for 4 seconds. Don't move that shoulder until someone looks at it. I'm sending my associate to drive you to UT Medical right now. Do not shower. Do not change your shirt. We are documenting everything tonight. Naomi. Every mark, every fiber of that shirt. Are we clear? Yes, ma'am. And Amos, you did the right thing calling me first. UT Medical confirmed the dislocation and a partial tear in the rotator cuff. They photographed the bruising across my shoulder blade and the scrape along my forearm where I'd caught the bench edge going down. Naomi's associate, a young woman named Grace, who was quieter than she looked, took her own photographs and wrote down the ER physician's exact language about the injury being consistent with blunt force trauma against a fixed surface. She drove me home at 11:30 with my arm in a sling. Naomi met me at my own kitchen table the next morning with 2 cups of coffee and a legal pad. "Before I file anything," she said, "I want to ask you one question. What do you actually want?" I looked out the window at the garage. The light was on because I'd left it on the night before. Florence's lockbox was on the workbench where I'd set it before Nash arrived. "I want my daughter safe," I said. "I want Florence's money to go where Florence intended it to go. And I want Nash Holbrook to understand that I am not the old fool he took me for." She wrote something on the pad. "And the 12,000? That would be nice. But it's not the point." "Good," she said, "because the point is going to cost him considerably more than 12,000. I called Nash from my own driveway the next morning before I left. Told him I'd thought about the 45,000, that I had something for him, and that I needed him to be alone because this was between us. He said Leona was at school and he'd be waiting. I took Florence's lockbox off the workbench. I'd built it from cherry wood in our first year of marriage, before I had proper equipment. Just a table saw and a borrowed router. The dovetails were hand-cut, which meant they were slightly imperfect, which meant I knew every one of them, the way you know the imperfections of something you made yourself. Florence had kept her mother's cameo brooch in it and a pearl earring she'd lost the match to, and a folded paper where she'd written down the names she'd wanted if we'd had a second child. We never did. I'd found the paper after the funeral. I hadn't been able to throw it away. Nash met me at the door in a pressed golf shirt. He looked at the box in my good hand, and something behind his eyes went quiet. "Florence would be proud," he said. I thought. Florence would know exactly what was in this box. And she would not be proud. She would be satisfied, which is a different and better thing. "Open it," I said. He flipped the small brass latch. He lifted the lid. His face went through 3 changes in about the time it takes a board to fall from a workbench. First, confusion. There were no account numbers, no check, no transfer paperwork. Second, a careful blankness, the kind a man puts on when he's processing something he doesn't like and doesn't want to show. Third, something that left his face the way color leaves a piece of paper held over a flame. On top was a sealed envelope from Knox County Criminal Court. Underneath that, a folder with Naomi Delafield's firm name on the tab. Underneath that, a certified document with a blue ribbon seal. What is this? It wasn't quite a question. The top envelope is the criminal complaint, I said. Aggravated assault, filed this morning at 8 o'clock. There is a mandatory appearance date inside. He put his hand on the edge of the lid. The second document is the petition for legal separation. Naomi filed it on Leona's behalf this morning. Leona signed it 3 days ago at my kitchen table. She wouldn't. She did. The third document is the temporary restraining order. You are not to contact Leona, come within 500 feet of her, my property, or her school. Service of process is complete. I paused. You installed a Ring camera above your front door last spring. Leona mentioned it. You watched me walk up on your own footage. You opened the door. You accepted the lockbox. Under Tennessee law, that constitutes valid service. His eyes moved to the small black dome above his own front door, then back to me. He said something that started with a word I won't repeat and ended with my name. Nash. I took 1 step forward. My arm was in the sling, and every movement pulled at the torn rotator cuff. I am 67 years old. I have a dislocated shoulder and a partial rotator cuff tear, and I drove 40 minutes this morning to bring you that box. You can put your hands on me again, right here, on your own camera. Or you can look at what's at the bottom. He was still. He didn't speak. After a moment, he lifted out the folder and the envelopes and set them aside. At the bottom of the lockbox was a single folded sheet of paper. He unfolded it. It was a printout of a civil judgment from Fulton County, Georgia. 3 years ago, a man named Nash A. Holbrook had been ordered to pay restitution of $22,000 to a retired engineer named Gerald Ostrowski after failing to deliver on a property investment agreement. Nash had relocated to Tennessee before the judgment could be collected. The name on the judgment was the same as the name on his Tennessee driver's license. Naomi's investigator had pulled it in under an hour. Nash's jaw worked. His face was past white now, into something I didn't have a name for. "There is one more thing," I said, "not in the box. Something you don't know about yet." I turned and walked out. I made it to my truck before my hand, on the key, was shaking badly enough to notice. I sat in his driveway for a minute with the engine off. My shoulder was screaming. I'd taken half a pain pill before leaving the house, not a full one, because I needed to be able to drive, and I needed to be able to think clearly. After a minute, I backed out slowly and drove 2 miles to the parking lot of the Ingles grocery store, and I cried for a little while in the front seat. The kind that doesn't make much sound, just the pressure behind your eyes until it passes. Then I drove home. The thing I hadn't told Nash about was Isaac Bauer. Isaac was 71 years old. He'd taught mathematics at a high school in Chattanooga for 29 years, retired at 67, and lived alone in a house on the north side of town since his wife passed. 2 years earlier, Nash had introduced himself at a financial planning seminar in Chattanooga. Nash had presented himself as a guest speaker, though the organizer later said he'd simply walked in off the street and taken a seat, and over the following month had convinced Isaac that a storage unit conversion project in Ottawa was a guaranteed 18% return in 16 months. Isaac had invested $31,000 from his retirement savings. The project was never built. The LLC Nash had shown Isaac was dissolved 4 months after Isaac's check cleared. When Isaac pressed, Nash had driven out to his house one evening uninvited, walked into his kitchen while Isaac was eating dinner, and told him that if he filed a complaint, he would make sure Isaac's son, who worked as a financial advisor in Nashville, heard about it in a way that could damage his license. Isaac had gone quiet after that. He'd sold a small coin collection to cover part of the loss. He hadn't told his son. He'd been carrying it alone for 2 years, telling himself the money was simply gone and there was nothing to be done. Naomi's investigator found him through a thread that started with Nash's dissolved LLC. When he called Isaac, Isaac asked if he could call back because he needed a moment. He called back 11 minutes later. I drove to Chattanooga on a Tuesday. Isaac met me at his door with the careful look of a man who has spent a long time deciding whether to be ashamed or angry and hasn't fully settled on either. We sat in his living room. He made instant coffee because he'd forgotten he was out of the ground kind, and he apologized for it twice. His hands were steady when he poured, but he set the pot down slightly too hard. "I keep telling myself I should have seen it," he said. "I taught math for 29 years. I should have run those numbers harder." "You ran the numbers he showed you," I said. "He just had better-looking fake numbers than you'd seen before." He looked at his coffee cup. "Isaac, would you be willing to testify, not just about the money, about what he said to you in your own kitchen?" He was quiet. "My son doesn't know." "I know." He stopped, shook his head. He'd be angry at Nash. Yes, he would. He'd probably blame himself for not catching it. "He'd also be in that courtroom beside you," I said, "which is exactly what Nash didn't want you to have." Isaac looked up. His eyes were wet at the corners. He nodded slowly and set down his coffee cup. "Tell me what to do," he said. "I made one mistake during all of this, and I have thought about it since." Naomi had told me clearly to stay off social media, to not post or respond to anything Nash's family said publicly. I was good about it until the Wednesday night I was in the workshop, trying to sand a corner joint smooth with one working hand, and I started thinking about Florence. About the last year, about how she'd asked Leona twice to bring her bank statements so Florence could look them over, because Florence had a feeling something wasn't adding up in their accounts. Both times, Leona had said Nash was handling it. Florence had mentioned it to me, and I had said, "Give them time, give them space, they'll work it out." I put down the sandpaper and I went inside and got on Facebook, and I typed a post that said, roughly, "Some men count on the people who love them to keep making excuses long enough for the damage to be done. I have spent 67 years learning that staying quiet is not the same as being kind. I am done being quiet for the wrong reasons." I did not name anyone. I posted it at 9:30 at night. By 7 the next morning, Naomi had already seen it. "Read me what you posted." She had a tone I hadn't heard from her. I read it. His attorney has a screenshot. They're going to argue you've been running a harassment campaign. They're going to use this to paint you as a vindictive man with a grudge rather than a victim. Do you understand what this costs us? I understand. Take it down while we're on the phone. I took it down. She was right that it cost us, not the verdict, but a month of depositions where Nash's attorney waved that post around like a battle flag. I taped an index card to the workbench afterward with 4 words on it. Right is not safe. It's still there. The criminal hearing was in October, Knox County General Sessions Court on Gay Street. The courtroom smelled like old carpet and the particular stillness of a room where people come to say hard things in front of strangers. Leona sat beside me in a gray dress she'd bought for the occasion. Her hand found mine several times. Nash sat across the aisle with his attorney and his mother, who kept touching his sleeve. He looked thinner than I remembered. He had not slept the sleep of a man at peace. I could see it in the set of his face. The assistant district attorney laid out the case the way you lay out lumber for a project. Methodically, nothing wasted. The Ring doorbell footage from Nash's own house played on the courtroom monitor. The medical records were entered into evidence. The photographs of my shoulder. The rotator cuff MRI. Leona's testimony was steady until the ADA asked her one specific question. Miss Holbrook, has the defendant ever been physically forceful with you? She paused. She looked at the judge. She looked at her hands. Then she looked directly at Nash, with the expression of someone who has made a final decision about what they're no longer afraid of. Yes, the first time was about 14 months into our marriage. He grabbed me by the wrist hard enough to leave a mark, because I'd told my father about a deal he was working on. The most recent time was 3 weeks before he hurt my father. He pushed me into the bathroom door because I'd looked at his phone. She took a breath. I photographed the mark on the door myself and emailed it to my own address, so he couldn't delete it. She didn't cry during the testimony. Afterward, in the hallway, she cried quietly into my good shoulder, and I held on and didn't say anything at all, because there wasn't anything to say that she didn't already know. Isaac testified next. He was nervous, his voice uneven at first, but when Nash's defense attorney suggested he had misunderstood a casual conversation with a friendly acquaintance, Isaac straightened in the witness chair and said, Sir, I taught algebra, geometry, and statistics to young people for 29 years. I understand numbers and I understand agreements, and I understand when I have been deliberately deceived. I am not here because I'm confused. I am here because I spent 2 years being ashamed when I should have been angry, and I decided it was time to be angry instead. The jury had seen what they needed to see before Nash ever took the stand. His attorney had clearly advised against it. Nash insisted, the way a certain kind of man always insists, because he'd spent his whole life being able to talk his way out of rooms and had never been in one where that stopped working. He contradicted himself about the Chattanooga project within the first 6 minutes. He lost his composure when the ADA walked him through the Georgia judgment, and when she placed the photograph of my shoulder on the evidence board, and asked him to explain how a 67-year-old man with no prior injury history came to present at an emergency room with trauma consistent with being slammed into a fixed surface. Nash pointed at me from the witness stand and said, That man drove his own daughter away from her marriage and had the nerve to call it love. The ADA let that sit in the air. Then she said, No further questions. The verdict came back the following afternoon. Guilty on the assault charge. Guilty on the fraud charge connected to Isaac Bauer. 14 months in county with a path to work release after 8. Restitution to Isaac, to the Yodowski estate in Georgia, and to me. A protective order for Leona running 5 years beyond his release date. When the bailiff moved to cuff him, Nash looked at his mother first, then at Leona, then at me. I held his gaze. I didn't nod. I didn't smile. I looked at him the way I look at a cut that has to be right on the first pass, because sometimes you don't get a second one. After a moment, he looked away. Leona and I walked out into the October afternoon and stood on the courthouse steps. The air smelled like leaves burning somewhere a few blocks off. She didn't say anything, and I didn't either. We stood there a while, which was enough. She moved back to Ridgecrest Lane that evening. 2 suitcases, a box of books, and the spider plant Florence had given her when she got her first apartment. A trailing green thing in a red clay pot that Leona had somehow kept alive all through the marriage. She set it on the kitchen windowsill, in the same spot where Florence had always kept it, and for a moment I had to turn and look at something else. That night, after she'd gone to bed, I went out to the workshop. The garage light threw its familiar yellow across the workbench. Florence's lockbox sat where I'd returned it. The evidence tag was still tied to the brass latch with a white string. I untied it, opened the lid. Empty now, except for the smell. Cedar and the faint ghost of the hand cream Florence had used for 30 years. I sat on the stool beside the workbench, the same stool she used to sit on while I worked, and I stayed there for a while without doing anything in particular. Outside, a car moved down Ridgecrest. An owl called once and went quiet. I reached into the scrap bin under the bench and pulled out a piece of walnut, small enough to fit in my palm. Even with one good hand, even with the rotator cuff still healing, I know what walnut wants to become just from the weight of it. This piece had a small burl near one end, a tight knot of grain that would catch the light a certain way once the finish went on. I set it on the bench beside the lockbox. I didn't start anything that night. My shoulder wasn't ready for it. But I thought about what I might make. Something small. Something Leona could keep on her windowsill next to the spider plant. A few days later, she found me in the workshop and stood in the doorway the way she used to stand in doorways when she was small. "Daddy," she said, "was it worth it?" I thought about that. Really thought. "I don't sleep the same as I used to," I said. "I don't trust the way I did. That's real, and I won't pretend otherwise." I set down the sandpaper. "But your mother kept 31 years of things she loved in that box, and the last thing she would have wanted was for it to be empty." Leona came over and sat on the stool. The October light came in through the garage window, long and low the way it does every year. The same light, the same angle. Isaac Bauer's son had called the week after the verdict to say thank you in a voice that broke twice. Nash Holbrook was going to spend 14 months thinking about what he'd taken and what it had cost him. The shoulder would heal, mostly, by spring. And the walnut burl was sitting on the workbench, waiting for my hands to be ready. I picked up the sandpaper and I kept working. Slowly, the way you work when one arm is still mending, and the person you're making something for is sitting right beside you, and you've got nowhere else you need to be.